speaking of films that were blinking and moved in their release date, I believe the next film we're going to discuss originally was slated for an early October release date, set to come out on October 6th. But the production company that put out Keeper was nervous about having to go head to head with Blumhouse's the Black Phone 2, not the iPhone 2, LOL, the Black Phone 2, which we saw. They thought that it was thematically similar, and so they decided to bump it into November. I would have preferred to have seen this around Halloween, but what were your thoughts on Keeper?
That's interesting. I didn't know that it was originally supposed to come out in October. Although I don't think the Black Phone 2 is really what they had to be worried about. Frankenstein is really the big horror hit of the season. I really like the Black Phone 2, but unfortunately I didn't hear too much about it. I think it made profit. I think it, much like a lot of the horror films, super cheap to make. It got enough people to watch it that it was worth making from the studio's perspective. I imagine there will be a third film in that series as well for the same reason. But yeah, Keeper, that's interesting. It does have some thematic similarities with the Black Phone 2. One interesting similarity that I noticed off the bat, that both the Black Phone 2 and Keeper both seemed influenced by Skinamarink, the Kyle Edward Ball horror film, which is one of my favorite horror movies in the last 5 or 10 years. I think that movie is brilliant. And I definitely am starting to see its influence on the aesthetic and approach visually of certain films. I saw that a lot in the dream sequences of Black Phone 2. I also saw that a lot in the sort of, architectural shots in this movie where, they're really focused on the interior of this cabin in the woods, which is honestly probably my favorite thing about Keeper. Zach, do you want to kind of tell people about what this movie is about?
Yeah, it's tough, and I want to do so without spoilers, right? Because I think that the best thing about this movie is that they did not really spoil any of it in the trailer. I didn't see any trailers, and when I bought my ticket, the plot line was extremely vague. It basically just said a woman and her boyfriend go and stay at his cabin in the woods, and you're like, okay, that could be any horror movie ever. But that's essentially what happens. You have a woman, she's been seeing a doctor for a year. They decide to get out of New York City and go to a cabin that he has in upstate New York, where they're going to spend a little bit of time with each other. The movie has a, kind of like a normal pacing. At that point, you're like, what's the story going to be? You then, over the course of the time, realize that things are not as they seem at this cabin. It is haunted. I think it's fair to say that people will understand that there's some sort of a keeper, a housekeeper that spiritually haunts or, is in charge of protecting, however you would like to, interpret it for yourself, spoiler free. That would be kind of the premise of this movie that we go into. Would there be anything that you would add to add clarity without spoilers?
I think that's a pretty good plot synopsis. The other thing I feel like is important to know about this movie is that it was made for under 10 million. And it was a quick, low-budget horror project shot during the WGA strike, starring non-union actors and written by a non-union Canadian writer. And that's according to World of Real, one of my favorite movie websites. But yeah, this movie is definitely a smaller project. It's clearly all shot basically in one location with a very small cast of people. It kind of reminds me of some of the movies that were made during the pandemic, honestly. Right? It just kind of feels like a group of friends, making something on a small scale without too much ambition. Almost more just like they're having fun or experimenting or something like that. And ultimately, that's the best thing about this movie to me, is kind of that spirit, that sort of like DIY spirit. This feels like something that you and a group of collaborators could make if you had a good enough camera, right? Because the cinematography in this is pretty good. Ultimately, I did have a lot of issues with it, specifically in the second half. I think Osgood Perkins is really great at setting up a movie with a really juicy, interesting premise. I think he has a harder time, figuring out what to do with said premise. That was a big issue I had with Longlegs. And again, not to get into any intense spoiler territory. If you obviously haven't seen Keeper yet, you should go check it out before you watch us talk about it. But we'll not spoil anything specifically. I will say, there's a lot of kind of artsy, Lynchian, surrealistic elements here, right? And I'm not opposed to that. What I am opposed to is including those sort of elements only to then explain in excruciating detail what's actually happening. I think if you're going to channel a director like David Lynch, something you should understand is that no answer is ever truly going to be satisfied, right? It's better to just keep the mystery alive than try to provide solid answers, I think, in a narrative structure like this. And much like in Longlegs, there's kind of mysterious, surreal events going on throughout the first half of the movie. And then quite literally, in the last act of the film, one of the characters sits down another character and explains everything. again, in excruciating detail, spoon feeds you everything that's happening, and it takes away all of that mystery. David Lynch used to talk about how like people would beg him for answers and say, what is that? What does Mulholland Drive actually mean? What does Lost Highway mean? What please explain this to me. And he would always say like, you think you want that answer, but you actually don't.
Yeah.
You think you want to know what it means, but you don't, because whatever it actually means isn't actually going to be as satisfying as the fun and in the mystery, wondering what the fuck did I just watch? What the fuck was that? That ambiguity. That's really where this style is at its best, in my opinion. So it's not that I really minded the surrealistic touches here, but I thought that it was cowardly to then explain them all, instead of just letting that mystery kind of envelop the film. Because at its best moments, yeah, it's absurdist, and you're like, what the fuck am I watching? And what the fuck is that? And what the fuck is going on? And again, no explanation is ever going to really be satisfying, in my opinion, specifically not the one that's provided here. Maybe there's a different writer that could have come up with something to make all of this make more sense. But when you actually do get the explanation, it feels very derivative. It feels very much like a horror short story that some like college student wrote or something, clearly inspired by a bunch of other better things. And to me, it just ultimately felt quite unsatisfying. Whereas the mood and atmosphere of the first half is pretty great.
Yeah, to unpack kind of from the beginning of what you were mentioning, I at first I had like big red flags. I was like, "What do you mean he was working around the strike? Fuck this guy. Osgood Perkins knows better. His father would have been a fucking ashamed if he was win." And then I read more into it after I was like, kind of like, what the fuck about this? Because it was 100% to keep people fed and working during the strike. Apparently, he was in the middle of shooting either Long Legs. I think it was Long Legs, and or some other pro. Oh, it was the monkey. Okay. Either way, and he was in the middle of this project, and a lot of the people that were on that project, they were like hand to mouth people working, and so he got the waivers that were necessary to make this. And I do like, as Gavin mentioned, that it feels very free. It feels very much like, hey, Osgood Perkins doesn't take himself too seriously. He doesn't need to have sound stages. He doesn't need to have all of this, high budget set and tech and all this stuff. He's willing to just grab his camera, get his homies. It's going to sound good. It's going to look good, and I'm going to make it. And I don't really care about what standard I've set for myself as a filmmaker. That sounds really harsh, but it does sort of seem like that was the attitude. It was very much like, I'm going to go make this art with whatever means that I have. And I enjoyed that about it a lot. However, to piggyback off of what you were saying, my Letterboxd review was that this was very NYU film school type stuff. And when I watched it, I felt like this is the kind of filmmaker, if I saw this at the beginning of your career, I would be so excited for what is to come, because it's brimming with talent. There's a lot of really sharp moments. There's the scene I won't spoil, but it really descends into like 15 minutes of a damn good home invasion movie. That element I loved. And you could tell that there was clear direction there, and that he was a guy that was able to set up scenes well. A lot of the cinematography, I've seen a few people in chat mention it. Gavin brought it up. There's a lot of really artful and interesting cinematography. At times, it felt a little bit like I'm learning how to do this technique and I want it included in my film for me. And that was where it felt like a tad unsophisticated, right? Because Gavin and I talk about it all the time. There's been a spate of David Lynch inspired Lynchian stuff that comes out, and the things that made Lynch a genius were all the things that Gavin just said about him. And when you kind of flatten it by just using the famous imagery that he used, which is like women screaming, or like interweaving faces over one another, or a ringing phone, or black and white tile, and things like that, where you're just completely divorcing it from what he was doing. One of the things that I didn't love about this film was that it opens with like swing music in a way that I thought was way too heavy-handed reference to David Lynch, where it's like, oh, I want to set this whole like Americana thing going before I get into the like surrealist element. And I was like, okay, you can do all of those things and that would be fine, but it does feel a little bit like a novice made this film. It feels a little bit like an entry point into the filmmaking game, to where there's like a lot of positive, but in my view, almost an equal amount of negative things to say about it.
Yeah, I think that's pretty well said. To me, Osgood Perkins is a director with so much talent and so much potential. I remember the first film of his I saw was The Black Coat's Daughter, and in my opinion, he kind of peaked as a director before he even really got discovered with Long Legs, which came out a few years ago, and that's what really blew him up. Since then, he's released I think like 2 or 3 movies. The guy's absolutely prolific. But yeah, to me, his best film is still easily The Black Coat's Daughter. And if you look at that movie, it's just so much. It feels so much less underbaked, right? It feels like, he spent more time working on the characters and fleshing out the world of that film, and ultimately the conclusion is so much more satisfying than I think of a lot of his recent stuff. like Longlegs and now Keeper, both movies that, again, I think have really good premises, but they feel underdeveloped and they feel ultimately rushed and underbaked, where there's like so much going on, but it's never actually brought to a satisfying conclusion. And I think that Osgood Perkins just needs to slow down a little bit because, again, he's a really talented director. He has a great understanding of mood and atmosphere. And I like the fact that a lot of times he does kind of lean into more experimental, interesting perspectives. Probably his most underrated film that people don't talk about is I'm the Pretty Thing That Lives in Your House. And that's a totally experimental ghost movie that's on Netflix. It's almost like no horror film I've ever seen, just the way it's constructed in a narrative fashion. Not that it's his best movie or anything, but I've always have liked that he has that ability to kind of do things in an unconventional way. Again, I just think he needs to take a little bit more time with the script and actually get a story to the point where it's actually fully finished and fully developed before he goes to shoot it. Because it feels like the guy is just too prolific. This is his second movie of the year. He also made The Monkey. Longlegs came out last year. He has so many projects that he's cooking up, and it's just like, dude, slow down a little bit. You have so much potential here, but these scripts aren't doing a service to your actual talent and to your actual abilities and potential as an artist, because they seem rushed, and it just seems like he doesn't quite know how to finish what he starts. So I'd love for him to really take a little bit more time with his next project, maybe collaborate with someone who knows how to really put a satisfying bow on a lot of these ideas that he clearly has. Because again, there's just so much potential here. I just feel like he's rushing through projects without fully developing or finishing them each at a time.
I completely agree with that. And I would even say it's a similar situation to someone who I would say is a more developed and a more successful filmmaker if you look at their complete output. But Luca Guadagnino left me feeling very similar when it came to After the Hunt. I thought that script was not up to par. I thought that it needed to be revised. I thought that there was definitely good material in it. And I think that Luca Guadagnino could have made a really interesting movie about academia and Me Too. And I would have had no problem with that. But I felt like there were really strong moments in After the Hunt, but if he'd let the cake bake a little bit longer and he'd, or moved on to something else and come back to it, we could have seen it executed better. I'm not sure if we would have ever seen a better executed Keeper given the circumstances that it was made under, but it does seem to be a theme for Osgood Perkins.
It would have been better if I'd edited it. I would have cut out significant sections of the movie and improved the film dramatically. And again, it's just like I just, and you're totally right. There's this like, it's become so popular, so in vogue to do the whole like, Lynchian kind of artsy surrealist thing. And it's kind of weird because when I first got into movies back in like the 2010s, the early 2010s, like that was my shit. Like I was seeking out the Lars von Trier, the David Lynch, all these like weird directors, Takashi Miike. I wanted to find the craziest, edgiest, most surreal shit out there. And now it just kind of seems like everyone's trying to do that. Like every time you go to the fucking movies, you have to see this like surrealism and this like provocative stuff and all this stuff, which I like. But it does feel like a lot of people want to go there without fully committing to it. And that's just my biggest issue with this film. Because if you really want to make something that's dreamlike and surreal and kind of a what the fuck experience, I think you need to commit to that and really immerse people in that dreamlike atmosphere without giving them the easy answers. And this film, almost in like a kind of weird M. Night Shyamalan way, it just has such a bizarre ending where it takes all of this interesting intrigue and mystery and ruins it by explaining it away with this like half-baked, stupid twist that feels completely out of nowhere, and that it feels like it's supposed to be this like shocking revelation, but you're just sitting there like, what? Like, okay. Like what? Like, okay, it doesn't really, it's not satisfying. It's not shocking. It's not scary. It just kind of feels stupid. And again, it just feels like a betrayal of what could have been something that was actually interesting and atmospheric and surreal and ambiguous that didn't give you all these fucking answers. And it would have been so much more interesting if the film had just edited out like 5 minutes of some of this heavy-handed derivative fucking narrative.
You could have taken 10.
Even 10, yeah, exactly. And just make it more about an experience, more about a visual experience, kind of like that film I was talking about, I'm a Pretty Thing That Lives in Your House, which has very little dialogue, very little plot in the traditional sense. I thought this movie could have leaned more into that and been more just like a visual dream, like nightmarish experience, right? Without giving you all of those easy answers. But that's a huge pet peeve of mine, and not even just when it comes to horror films, not even just when it comes to stuff like this. I remember putting my head in my fucking hands and almost screaming while I watched Interstellar, a movie that people love, because I remember seeing it in theaters, and there's a scene similarly towards the end where the fucking main character just explains everything. There's all this, beautiful, mind blowing kind of shit going on, and then they just explain it all, and then it's not as powerful to me. So that's a real pet peeve for me. I always hate it when directors do that, and to see Osgood Perkins now do it twice, it just gave me flashbacks to Longlegs again, which has such a brilliant setup, such a great first like 60% of the movie. You're like, what am I watching? That's another movie that's clearly very inspired by David Lynch and Twin Peaks specifically. But again, then it just sits you down and it's like, here's the easy answers that you think you want, but that are actually just going to make this whole experience infinitely less satisfying and interesting.
Yeah, I think the greatest sin you can make with your movie is taking a climactic moment to end it and then adding like 15 or 20 more minutes of useless junk at the end. And I think that we saw that, as you mentioned, in Keeper, and it just fucking spoils the fun. It makes me like walk out of the theater with a bad taste in my mouth. We talked about it when we left. There were two moments where I think you probably could have gotten away with ending Keeper, and I would have been far happier with the ending that we ultimately got. And at that point, then I'm just ready to go to the bathroom. I'm just ready to fucking get up. I'd be like, I've got the point of your movie. Like, I already thought you should have ended it. You're not doing anything new. And the only way to win me back at that point is to fucking blow my mind in those last extra minutes and be like, no, this is why it had to end that way. I think about a movie like Casino Royale, where I'm like, why didn't it end at the first? And it's because it's going to blow your freaking mind with the second ending. That works because then you get that wham charge payoff. Like, I thought it was over, and then I got another flood of dopamine. This movie, their payoff at the end was whack.
As much as I love Casino Royale, I do think it goes on for a little bit too long.
I watched it this time, and I was like,
so?
This time I bought the fucking whole way in because I normally felt that way, but then I was watching it and I was like, let me just go in and be like completely like I don't have anything to do. And then that like the twist at the end, spoiler alert, don't listen any further if you haven't seen Casino Royale, but it's all worth it for the moment when she like fucking pulls it and she fucking drowns and kills herself. Right.
Oh yeah, I agree, but I don't know. That's sure. A different discussion for another day.
We'll have a long Casino Royale discussion someday.
Yeah. Ultimately, though, I don't want to seem like we're too negative on Keeper. It's a perfectly fun, enjoyable movie. I'm glad I saw it in the theater. There's a lot of good atmosphere. I really enjoyed the main performance by Tatiana Maslany. I thought she was really good in the film and made it worth watching. Because again, the whole movie is basically like the camera's on her for almost like 90% of the film. With a lesser actress in that role, I don't think it would have worked as well. And she does hold it down. She has great facial expressions. She really kind of channels this like, paranoia and like sort of like feeling like you're increasingly trapped somewhere. She does a great job. So the film is good. It was disappointing to me. And ultimately I felt like it should have, he should have spent a lot more time kind of ironing out the script and specifically the third act, exactly as I felt with Longlegs. There's so much potential here that unfortunately kind of gets ruined by a clumsy and underdeveloped final act twist that just comes off as more silly and kind of ruins any of the tension and genuine horror that's presented in the premise of the story.
Yeah, I was maybe slightly more off put by things that I would describe as like amateurish flourishes and motifs that I thought that he flattened and a little bit of guilty of being derivative of like probably 5 or 6 other horror movies that I've like. We didn't even mention it. There's just an insane ripoff of the movie Creep in a moment of this, and I'm like, come on, dude. Like, you're at the level where you're not just making this for your friends. Like, everybody that's seen this has also seen all those movies that you love. And it's one of those things where it's like, yeah, bro, like we already all watched that. So when you saw that, you were like, that's a great idea. Like, we also were like, oh shit, I know exactly where you ripped off that really good idea from. So again, at the risk of sounding very harsh, I'm going to come in and say strong 4, soft 5, but I gave it 2 out of 5 on Letterboxd.
There you go. Yeah, I would go a 5 out of 10. Solid 5 out of 10. It's nothing terrible, but it was disappointing for me. And I think Osgood Perkins ultimately is capable of much more